What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson, and my guest today is an author, an activist, a playwright, a novelist, and the director of Foreign Policy in Focus, a project at the Institute for Policy Studies. This is arguably the first genuinely progressive think tank in Washington to tackle the substance of national security topics. The Institute has a storied history on the left that, maybe we'll touch on. But I first interacted with this guy almost 14 years ago because he probably doesn't even remember this, but he gave me my first writing opportunities as a contributing blogger to Foreign Policy in Focus, right? So doing progressive foreign policy blogging. And this was before I went into the Pentagon, before I got my PhD. But crucially, this guy's got a new book out called Right Across the World, The Global Networking of the Far Right and the Left Response. It's a swift, penetrating analysis of the global far right and transnational neo-fascism. And then the thing that's unique, some people have written about this already, the thing that's unique is to explicitly position what the left response ought to be and is, right? So the person I'm talking about is the one and only John Feffer. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. And it was a great pleasure to learn that I was responsible for ushering you into the world of punditry. I knew that, of course, we were publishing you. I didn't know it was the first foray for you.
Yeah. It was these things, big outcomes with small beginnings or whatever. It was not significant for you guys, but it was significant for me. So I don't know. It's always got a special place in my heart, that experience. But I want to get to the book, and that was kind of the impetus for bringing you on the show. But your biography is interesting, and one of the things that we do in these interview episodes where I bring on experts is to pick at what your background is or your biography. I'd say a large, maybe half of our audience is Gen Z and millennials who are either interested in foreign policy or the world of foreign affairs broadly. They benefit, and frankly, I benefit too, from learning about how people sort of navigated the world of, not just punditry, but sort of foreign affairs broadly. Increasingly, the world of writing and publishing, because that's an important part of all of this. If we could just start at the very beginning, what's some bio data on you? Where'd you grow up? What did your parents do? What'd you study in school? All that stuff.
So I grew up in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, just across from New York, across the George Washington Bridge. And it was a public high school, but a very good one where I actually could study Russian, which was unusual at a public school in the United States. And my parents...
This was during the Cold War, obviously.
This was near the kind of the latter years of the Cold War. So I graduated from high school in '82. Okay. So this was before Gorbachev, of course, but it was still, it could be controversial to be learning Russian at that point. My father, an academic, professor of psychology. My mother, teacher in the public school system. Both of whom I think were very supportive of anything I did, but they were especially excited about my going on to graduate school and getting a degree, which I ultimately failed to do and probably disappointed them greatly for not getting that degree. But nevertheless, they instilled in me a great respect for education and for learning. And when I went off to college, small college in Pennsylvania, Haverford College, I initially had no intention to continue my study of Russian, but the folks at Bryn Mawr, which was the sister institution of Haverford, had an excellent Russian department and a very welcoming one. Welcoming in the sense that on every Friday night, they had a vodka and pierogi party.
And that welcoming,
yeah. So I almost, just backed my way into a Russian studies degree in addition to the English degree that I took. But I took no politics courses.
Hmm.
I had no interest in foreign policy in the academic sense, though of course I was very involved in the activism of the era,
Hmm.
which was at that time the anti-apartheid movement, um, and working to prevent U.S. military intervention in Central America. Those were the kind of two lodestones, if you will, for foreign policy activism at that time. When I graduated, which was '86, I spoke Russian. I can't say I spoke it fluently, but I spoke it well enough. My Russian teacher really encouraged me to join the CIA. Said I put my talents to good use. And I said, look, I don't agree with the CIA's mission. And he said, well, the most important thing is that we have good people in there.
Hmm.
And that, is a perennial argument, and one I didn't actually support at that time. But instead, I was able to get a job at the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker institution.
Oh,
And
yeah.
there was a natural kind of overlap there. Haverford was and is, at least nominally, a Quaker institution of higher education. And AFSC, then and still now, although in a lesser sense, has been at the forefront of all the major social movements in the United States, and was very active on foreign policy questions as well. And I got a job working on Russian issues as the lowest possible position, a administrative assistant, essentially a secretary, but with someone, Michael Simmons, a kind of long-time civil rights activist, who gave me the space to do work, and even in that position that employed my Russian language and my Russian studies background.
Was it of a sort of policy analysis variety, or like an organizing on behalf of policy positions or policy issues, or something else entirely?
It was mostly on the analysis side. I mean, this was 1987,
Hmm.
and so there was 2 years after Gorbachev had taken over in the Soviet Union. And I had been in the Soviet Union studying in 1985, the spring after he had taken over. So I had had a kind of bird's eye view of what was taking place in the Soviet Union at that time. And I judged it to be very significant. And, obviously, from hindsight, everyone knows it was
Yeah.
significant. But in 1987, there was still a great deal of doubt as to whether Gorbachev represented an actual change in the Soviet Union, or whether he was just the latest apparatchik to come along with promises of change, but no substance behind that. So in that year, 1987, I kind of devoted myself to chronicling the development of glasnost, of openness, and perestroika, the economic restructuring that was taking place in the country,
Mhm.
essentially to demonstrate that this was the real thing. And then went on to cover those issues a little bit more in depth later on.
So how long were you at the, what was it, American Friends Services Committee?
Hmm. So in that particular position, I was there for exactly 1 year, which is,
Okay.
now, of course, 1 year, it seems like nothing, but when you're 22, 23 years old, it seems like an eternity,
Yeah,
to be in
seriously.
one place and one job for a whole year.
Yeah.
Um, and I chafed at being just an administrative assistant. I was interested in doing something more than that, and I got a fellowship in Washington. It's known as the Herbert Scoville Fellowship in Arms Control,
Yeah.
and it was early on in that fellowship, I was maybe the second or third class in that fellowship, and I came to Washington, for the interview for the position, and I had written an essay basically saying that I thought that arms control was a crock of shit. That I thought that disarmament was the most important thing, and arms control was actually a deterrent to disarmament. Arms control was just a way of not even reducing nuclear weaponry. It was a way of establishing ceilings to which one could build up one's nuclear arsenal. And I found myself in front of probably a dozen of the most important arms control people in Washington to defend my position. which I did find daunting, but apparently I did it well enough to win that fellowship. And I went to work at Nuclear Times Magazine, which was at that time a kind of it was really the only publication for the disarmament community.
This is a point that I feel like is lost to history for a lot of people now, especially like young people who study nukes and with the implicit premise that, basically nukes are bad, right? And the line that like, a nuclear war can never be won and should never be fought. People internalize, like the younger generation especially, will internalize these things as truths. But then there's this question of A, the world as it is, kind of awash in nuclear weapons and pointing in the wrong direction. But B, like arms control, there's such a right-wing tilt to Washington now that arms control itself is like very progressive and a bridge too far for most people in Washington, frankly. But there was a time in the like 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s, I suppose, like you're on this thread where arms control was seen as like kind of a reactionary move that supported militarism in a way because it subverted or prevented disarmament. And disarmament as like a paradigm had all of these, policy ideas, policy options to like further along the process of nuclear disarmament. And the advocacy for arms control became a way of like foreclosing the disarmament paradigm itself. And I think the way a lot of people think now, it's like, well, arms control, if you want disarmament, you have to go through the process of arms control. But there really was a time, and you're speaking to it very like frontally, there was a time when arms control was a way of almost delegitimizing disarmament. Does that strike you as correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you might remember what St. Augustine famously said. He said, give me chastity, but not yet. And essentially that's what arms control advocates were saying up until, you can find them still today, I suppose, but give me disarmament, but not yet. And arms control was basically, an effort to institutionalize nuclear arsenals. I mean, deterrence was the kind of key component of an arms control perspective. Mm-hmm. That one effectively needed nuclear weapons to counter the nuclear arsenals of other countries. To bring them down in any radical fashion would be to destabilize the entire kind of system of deterrence and prove far more dangerous than what was considered a relatively safe status quo. And disarmament advocates, of course, challenged that and said, no, we can reduce arsenals in a mutually beneficial way, in a way that's not dangerous. But, as you've said, things have changed. And, when we think of, for instance, the Iran nuclear deal as an arms control effort and the importance of supporting something like that, I mean, in an ideal world, all the countries would be meeting their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That means all the nuclear powers had essentially agreed as part of the NPT to reduce their nuclear arsenals. They, of course, haven't done so in any substantial way. I mean, there have been some reductions, but and the countries outside the NPT, countries like Iran, would say, okay, well, we're agreeing to this Non-Proliferation Treaty under the assumption that all the members of the nuclear club are reducing their arsenals. But that deal has largely disappeared, and we're left with things like the Iran nuclear deal, which didn't require the United States to reduce any of its nuclear weapons. It simply required the United States to, eliminate sanctions against Iran in exchange for Iran, basically giving up its nuclear weapons capability, or its attempt in one way or another to create a nuclear weapons capability. And so, I mean, that becomes in this day and age an absolutely essential kind of kind of treaty to support against those who, like Trump and everyone else in his political camp, who had no interest whatsoever in that kind of arms control. So you're absolutely right that the debate in many ways has shifted since the 1980s.
Yeah, it's important. I'm glad you brought this whole thing up, though, because my ideas about this are very inchoate, but I feel like as a larger project, it's kind of important for the left to recover some of this disarmament history, because there were ideas in it that have been completely erased from like mainstream discourse and implicitly made taboo or whatever, stigmatized, because they were associated with disarmament, and the conversation has shifted so much that like we I don't know, we're not a very good opposition anymore. Like we're like Republican light, but also B, there actually were tractable ideas. There were periods in all the way into like the 60s where, the Kennedy administration itself and Institute for Policy Studies was part of this, was actively looking at different analysis and pathways and roadmaps for disarmament with the Soviets and having those conversations, and it's like, that's so far gone now, anyways, there's a related thread here, arms control, Iran, North Korea. I've always been very impressed by your breadth. You do many things, which I want to get into, and I try to sort of operate in a similar way, a little bit Renaissance man-y. But one of the areas where we converged is on North Korea. Like, how do you come to be a Korea watcher, right? Like, you've been to North Korea. Can you talk about all that?
Sure. So, as you probably can deduce from my description of my early biography, I was pretty much a person who focused on, the Soviet Union and then later Eastern Europe. I lived in Poland in 1989 and traveled throughout the region, again, for the American Friends Service Committee in 1990, and continued to follow events in Russia and Eastern Europe throughout the 1990s. But during that time, when I was at AFSC, one of the staff people there, Chung-Hae Yu, who focused on Korea, kept urging me to look at Korea. And I kept saying, Chung-Hae, I've got a lot on my plate. There's so much going on in Eastern Europe. I don't have really a lot of time. But she said, no, you really have to look at North Korea. I mean, this is key to understanding what's going on in the world today.
This is like late 80s or?
This would have been in the 90s. So
Okay.
This is from like 93 to 95, 96.
Okay.
And meanwhile, I met my current wife at the time, and she had studied in Beijing. She spoke Chinese, and she was eager to get back to Asia. And there was an opening for AFSC's international affairs representatives in East Asia. We applied, and she brought the Asia experience, and I brought the experience of being an international affairs representative in Eastern Europe for AFSC. And together we kind of were a perfect couple, and they liked hiring couples for these jobs.
Nice.
So they chose us, and we went over in 1998, based in Tokyo. And the interesting thing was how ignorant I was. I mean, I have to be right out front. I mean, I thought I had had a good education, in high school and college, and I had a passing familiarity with Asian culture and history.
Mm-hmm.
But when I started to learn Korean and I started to study the books of Korean history books about Japan and China, I realized that I knew nothing. I mean, I knew nothing, and it was such a humbling experience to think that I was so well-rounded and so well-educated, only to discover that I knew zero about what constituted half the world. This was astonishing to me. So those 3 years we spent in Japan, where we focused our work on the two Koreas, were a profound kind of educational experience for me. and learning Korean, or attempting to learn Korean, since I don't think I ever particularly spoke it very well. But that in itself was important, because it really opened a window onto a different way of approaching culture, approaching communication, etc. We were supposed to focus on North Korea, and AFSC was involved in North Korea for some time prior to our beginning these jobs, and had established a relationship with 3 farms in North Korea. They were providing inputs, agricultural inputs, and expertise to these farms. And when the famine hit in the early 90s, so about 93, 94, up through 99, AFSC kind of switched over to providing considerable amount of humanitarian aid and participating in the global efforts, both at a civil society level and at a governmental level, to ensure that not everyone in the country was going to die of famine. Our job, we were not agronomists, so our job was to identify other kinds of exchanges that the US in particular could sponsor with North Korea, that could provide the country with the kind of knowledge necessary to, well, get out of its predicament. And as a result of that, we did medical exchange. We tried to do some exchanges on architecture and on energy. But North Korea was not an easy place to work in, and certainly not an easy place to work with.
Yeah.
And we ended up, I ended up focusing a lot of my work in South Korea. My partner ended up doing a lot of work in China and Taiwan. And in South Korea, I worked on security issues, but more in depth, I did a year-long training on conflict resolution at the request of 5 different civil society organizations. And I told them, look, I'm no expert on conflict resolution. Are you sure you want me to be the one who is setting up this program for you? And they said, absolutely. It's because you're not an expert that we trust you. We know that you're not trying to sell us a particular kind of approach. We trust that you will be even-handed and you'll learn alongside us. And I kind of like that. So that's what I ended up doing for the better part of a year.
Okay, so you're in Japan under the auspices of AFSC. You're facilitating people-to-people type exchanges, like Track 3 style exchanges with North Korea. What is it what's the jump to Institute for Policy Studies? When does that happen? Or how do you go from Japan to IPS?
Mm-hmm. So I'd been affiliated with this Foreign Policy in Focus project for several years before we even went off to Japan. I had done some briefings for them on NATO and on European issues, on Russia and the emerging policies of the Yeltsin administration and US-Russian relations. So when we got back from Tokyo, we relocated to Washington, which, by the way, was not my choice. If it had been me, I would never return to Washington. My one experience there in 1988 had been enough. I thought of Washington as being a very blinkered and ultimately conservative place, not necessarily conservative politically,
culturally,
yes, culturally. But my wife got a job doing North Korea work, and there aren't too many places in the United States where you can do North Korea work. So we relocated to Washington, and for, I'd say, the first 5 years, I was working as a freelancer. I wrote articles for a variety of different publications, and I continued to contribute to Foreign Policy in Focus. In 2006, there was an opening. They needed a co-director. FPIF was a joint project of IPS and something called the Interhemispheric Resource Center, which was located out in New Mexico, which generally focused on border issues in Latin America. But the IRC hired me as their co-director alongside Mira Woods, the IPS co-director. And I had a great relationship with folks at IPS, thought I had a good relationship with the folks at IRC. That turned out to be not such an easy marriage to continue. The
two
IRC.
institutional relationships, you mean?
Exactly, yes. So the IRC basically collapsed after a year, and IPS very kindly brought me on as an IPS person in 2007, and I've been there ever since.
Interesting. So, can you talk a little bit about what the Foreign Policy in Focus project does? Like a lot of it is a progressive slant. It doesn't seem to be openly partisan, but like certainly like a progressive sensibility in analyzing foreign policy.
That's correct. We're definitely not partisan in the sense that we were started in the mid 90s as a response to Clinton's foreign policy, Bill Clinton's foreign policy. And, Clinton had come into office promising a new multilateralism, a kind of new relationship between the United States and the world, which was very promising. But very quickly, Clinton kind of turned his back on that promise, in part because of events that took place outside of his control and outside the United States, such as, what was going on in Somalia, the breakdown of the state there, the genocide in Rwanda, the breakdown of certainly the breakdown of Yugoslavia and the continued wars of succession there.
Yeah.
So, but we were very disappointed with Clinton's approach. And not just on the kind of security side, but particularly on the economic side. Clinton, of course, was very supportive of what has been called the Washington Consensus, neoliberalism. And so in 1996 or so, FPIF came into existence basically to articulate a different kind of progressive foreign policy, one that was very different from what had emerged as the kind of Clintonian consensus within the Democratic Party. By the time I became more active in FPIF, of course, the politics had shifted. So, the first book I did for FPIF was on the Bush administration's foreign policy, the George W. Bush administration's foreign policy. After 2001, after the attacks of 9/11. So, FPIF has, across administrations, kind of asserted a progressive foreign policy based on, what we consider to be real multilateralism that doesn't put the United States either as number one or even as first among equals, but in a truly cooperative relationship with the rest of the world.
Yeah. So I want to talk about your book, and I'm cognizant that we haven't even started talking about it yet now. This book, the title, again, Right Across the World, The Global Networking of the Far Right and the Left Response. This is an issue I've kind of become obsessed with the last few years, and I found that it's pretty hit and miss when it comes to how much progressives are actually concerned about this. The far right, or the right-wing phenomenon, I think you call it like the new right, frequently in your book. Global far right is a phenomenon people are studying. Neo-fascism, right-wing populism. There's like different synonyms that are like, they're not always the exact same thing, but like they're part of like a sort of overlapping common phenomenon. I thought your book did a great job of diagnosing what's going on here. So, for people who aren't familiar, can you sort of give the elevator pitch of the book and like outline what the arguments are that you set out to demonstrate?
Sure. So the book attempts to understand the roots of the popularity of the far right, and how a group of nationalists who might otherwise not think about kind of international solidarity have essentially changed their tune over the last decade or so in order to build power at a global level. The book looks at kind of three roots of the far right's appeal. And it's true, I use the term new right because I wanted to understand this overlap between traditional conservatives and alt-right and an extreme right. And, because we often have this kind of terminological difficulty in understanding the right wing and where to place it along the spectrum, because of those three, traditional kind of conservatives, alt-right, and extreme right, there's considerable overlap in their positions, but there are some important divergences as well. But in any case, the roots of popularity for this new right, and identify it as essentially a rejection of globalization and global elites, a rejection of the political parties that have supported the globalization project, and a rejection of globalization's kind of cultural manifestations. In other words, immigration or people on the move, as well as often ideas, liberal ideas on the move, if you will, like the promotion of Hollywood films. And then I try to understand the three levels of cooperation among the far right or new right actors: governmental level, the level of civil society organizations on the right, and then the messaging that takes place that is promoted by often individuals rather than institutions or governments per se. And then finally, I look at what the left response can and should be to what I consider to be an urgent issue, an urgent challenge to democracy, to rule of law, to modern society, effectively.
So where did this book come from? Like, how did you decide? Taking on any book project is it's an intense commitment. You've hit a lot of different sort of topics and themes in your writing. Like, you're a broad guy who then cultivates specialties along the way or whatever. But what made you focus in on this? Like, why'd you write the book?
Well, clearly the election of Donald Trump was a motivating factor.
Backdrop, yeah.
To use an analogy, a lot of people may think about climate change, but they're not really that concerned about it because it's happening to islands off in the Pacific or, the shorelines of distant countries. But when it happens to them, then suddenly climate change is a really important issue.
Yeah.
So, here in the United States, this is not just an issue of the National Front in France or Viktor Orban in Fidesz in Hungary. This is a serious issue right here and now. And then, of course, after Trump's election, we saw, the election of Bolsonaro. We saw the election of Duterte, who, kind of straddles categories, political categories. And, we saw the kind of consolidation of power among existing authoritarian / right-wing leaders like Orban. So I thought it was important to put Trump's victory in context, to understand how this could happen to us. And it wasn't just a question of trying to figure out, well, what's the kind of general idea or epistemic, environment in which Trump is operating. I wanted to look at, what are the concrete alliances that are being made at a governmental level, at a party level, at a civil society level. And to do that, I basically started calling people in countries all around the world to get their perspective on what was happening in their country, to understand those very specific contexts and to see where basically the lines started to converge. And that was the origin of this book.
How much of it were you writing during the pandemic? It's clear that the pandemic had already started before the book was finished, because you sort of address how the global far right basically doesn't have an answer to this kind of existential problem. But like, had you started writing this pre-pandemic, or were you all in on the pandemic? Like, what was the writing timeline?
Sure. So I did the interviews in the spring and summer of 2019, and I produced a report that we published at IPS in December of 2019. So then, of course, the pandemic hits in March. I think I had a book contract before the pandemic hit, but there wasn't a requirement to submit a manuscript until I think the following January. So I had some time to kind of to sit back and see how the pandemic was altering the political environment. And in fact, did a different book that focused exclusively on the pandemic that we published before this one. It came out that September through Seven Stories Press, a component of which looked at kind of the pandemic's impact on authoritarian politics and right-wing politics. But then I kind of adapted some of that material and really changed this book as a result.
On the substance of the argument, or the substance of the book, the Bernie Sanders and Yanis Varoufakis was calling this global far right thing like the nationalist international, and you at some point you mentioned that phrase in your book, which kind of captures the paradox, or like maybe that was why people didn't take this too seriously. You know, the global far right problem, because the notion of like international solidarity among people who, you know, their ideas and identities are sort of local and exclusionary. It seems like they would be incongruous. Like it's not possible to have a nationalist international, would be like the sort of conventional wisdom. But then this is a growing problem that they focus on, right? Bernie and Yanis. But then also this is like the crux of the book. Can you say a little bit about the cleavages within the new right? And how is it that like that they manage this move of like bridging their own differences?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I'd say that, you know, the message, the anti-globalist message, the hyper-nationalist message, is extraordinarily important for building a constituency within a country. It's not particularly useful beyond one's borders, but it's extremely effective for gaining political power. Sometimes beginning at a regional level and then moving on to acquiring national power. So that message is extremely important, regardless of what, you know, the strategies and tactics might be for a foreign policy or for international, you know, alliance building. But, you know, it became useful, I think, for the far right to think about international connections. Obviously, that was the case, you know, in a space like the European Union, where, you know, you already have a kind of an imperative to think about what's beyond your borders because you are operating within a pan-European space. So the far right in Europe is already ahead of us in some sense in thinking transnationally. And here you have, you know, the paradox writ small, because, you know, many of the far right movements in Europe, if not all of them, were Eurosceptical. In other words, they were as hostile towards Brussels as they were towards globalists in general. Mm-hmm. So Brussels kind of stands in for the IMF or the World Bank in their kind of worldview, and yet they're running for office, you know, in the European Parliament. You know, so the far right, despite its Euroscepticism, is participating in trans-European politics. And it's one thing if you have, like, you know, 4 members of the European Parliament that represent the far right, you know, among all the hundreds of representatives, you can continue to maintain your Eurosceptical position. And, you know, Nigel Farage was famous for doing that, for basically, you know, he was a representative at the European Parliament for years, and he did nothing. You know, he barely showed up. When he showed up, he'd kind of fly his Union Jack flag and he'd thumb his nose at everybody. Well, that's fine when you're just, you know, a very small minority. But the far right started to win more seats in the European Parliament, and suddenly they realized, aha, you know, okay, we might be Eurosceptical, we might be skeptical about this project, but suddenly we have the opportunity to have an influence over this project. So there was a subtle change, maybe perhaps not so subtle when you look back at it, but away from a kind of rejectionist position to a, let's work within the system and change the system position. Mm-hmm. But that, of course, gets us to the second part of your question, which is what are the cleavages within the far right and the challenges of a nationalist international, if you will. Yeah. And again, let's start with Europe. We saw that very recently when the far right's European parliamentary delegation, the various parties that participate in it, gathered together. I think they met in Warsaw to work out a kind of common agenda for their activity at the European Parliament. And they couldn't do it. I mean, beyond some vague, consensual positions. And they couldn't do it because there were some significant disagreements that they had. And perhaps the most important one was their position on Russia, with the Poles and some others saying there's absolutely no way we are going to support anything connected to Vladimir Putin and Russia. Simply not going to happen. And the Poles are kind of legendary for their anti-Russian attitudes. Whereas the Hungarians, who, of course, up until Viktor Orban became prime minister again in 2010, were also legendary for their anti-Soviet and anti-Russian perspectives, have under Orban experienced a sea change. And Orban himself was basically embraced by Putin and Putin's illiberal politics. So this is a major kind of schism that runs right through the European far right. But there are innumerable other issues that make a nationalist international challenging. So for instance, you look at LGBT questions. In Europe in particular, there are a number of leaders who come from the LGBT community and are well represented on the far right. Whereas in other parties, they're explicitly homophobic and have taken, very conservative, quote unquote, pro-family positions. And you look at what Orban has done in Hungary. He's basically rewritten the constitution to say that in Hungary, it's, a family has to be between a man and a woman as mother and father in the constitution. So that's a pretty significant cleavage. There are other cleavages. I mean, obviously around questions of vaccines, around QAnon and conspiracy theories, on immigration. I mean, in general, the far right is unified in their dislike of immigration, but not all the far right supports remigration. In other words, kicking out your existing immigrants. That's something that for instance, the Alternative for Deutschland supports in Germany. That's a bridge too far for a number of the far or new right political groups.
So there's like worry and then also hope, I guess, because it's such an unnatural formation, but out of almost strategic interest, there are convergences around shared narratives, but those shared narratives are kind of thin because there's just so much that they can't agree on. Okay, so, you rightly point out that the right's kind of militarized, racialized worldview has no answers to the existential threats that face the world today, like, climate change and pandemics and arguably nukes too. And I agree that this, reality of a mismatch between threats and solutions, it's an advantage for the left or an opportunity. I think you couch it as an opportunity for the left in the book, but it's kind of like demographics being an intrinsic advantage of the left too, right? Like the Democratic Party would be like, well, demographics are on our side, right? Like there's, the arc of history kind of argument, which is to say, like, it's kind of a theoretical advantage, or like in the abstract, there's a potential advantage here in the fact that like the way the right thinks about security doesn't actually address security as in like existential threats, and so like there's a gap to be exploited. I guess the question is like, based on the research and talking to, progressives who are mobilizing for this, like how do we exploit that gap or that possibility, right? Like we have this reality advantage. Reality is on our side. So, but we have to do something to sort of capitalize on that. Is like, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, first I'd say that, I think the left has an opportunity to address these existential questions or threats. But these are threats that I consider to be existential.
I mean, they are, right? Like this is,
well, yeah.
If you're saying,
I mean, there is an agreement among a lot of people that this is an existential crisis.
Yeah.
Climate change and the pandemic. But for the far right, they have an entirely different set of existential threats that they have been able to motivate their constituencies to rally around. I mean, so for white nationalists, it's the threat that white people will no longer have a dominant place in society.
So the great
For
replacement
evangelical,
kind of.
exactly, yeah. For evangelical Christians, it's the breakdown of the traditional family. I mean, for them, that's a very serious existential crisis, and it's extremely motivating. And I'm sure there's someone on the other side of the political spectrum who's saying, the left has no answer to this that is motivating, our constituency. We have this great opportunity, and they're right, So we have to acknowledge that first of all, and then in terms of addressing climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, and so forth. Yes, this is an opportunity, but again, back in 1999, the left had identified economic inequality and the gap between, say, global institutions and global democratic governance as this great opportunity for mobilization. And in fact, it was. And so the left had, motivated in the United States to march in Seattle against free trade agreements, and there were similar movements around the world. But fast forward 20 years,
didn't work
and
out.
who is taking advantage of those issues? It's not the left for the most part. It's the far right, which has stolen the thunder, if you will, from the left on this anti-globalization agenda. So what can the left do now? Okay, acknowledging that number one, the far right has its own existential crises that it's responding to, and which prove very motivating for their voters to come to the polls. And number two, that the left has identified existential problems in the past and failed to kind of translate that into significant policy transformation. What can we do now, acknowledging that history? Well, I mean, I do think that the terms have changed in part for two reasons. One, because the pandemic has, I think, changed the terms of engagement when it comes to resources and the amount of resources that are made available for addressing an issue. Countries have mobilized enormous packages for recovery from the pandemic, and the populations have begun to realize that, hey, that argument that was used before, we don't have enough money to address climate change, we don't have enough money to protect ourselves from a potential pandemic, that argument no longer flies after the mobilization of these resources. The second is that climate change is, as I said, no longer an abstraction. It is an existential, it's not a philosophical problem, which people are kind of debating and saying, well, it's better to start now, but, we could, as long as we kind of get around to this issue by 2050, we'll be okay. Now, that's no longer the case. I mean, people, I forget the percentage, there was a New York Times article, said, like something like 50-60% of people around the world have been touched by climate change one way or another, adversely. I'm not talking about positive signs of climate change. So those two things, I think, have changed the political terms, and that the far right has not caught up to that. What is the far right doing? The far right is complaining about vaccine mandates. It's complaining about government intrusion in their lives. It's complaining often about the recovery packages and the size of them. It continues to be more or less denialist about climate change, although there are some eco-fascists and there are some kind of far-right people who propose, some half-assed response to climate change, like planting 1 million trees or whatever. And that the insufficiency of the far-right's response to what currently is challenging us, not the kind of existential problems as posited a decade ago, but what currently we face, that's the opportunity that progressives can seize upon. But they have to seize upon it in more than just, say, a campaign program. Like, we're going to talk about this, we're going to develop a couple of policies, and that should bring voters out to the polls and get us elected. Well, that's probably not going to do the trick. I think what the left has to do is say, look, we we are screwed. I mean, I think a lot of people in the world understand the severity of the crises that we face, and we have to come up with a response that is commensurate with the urgency of the task. It has to be big, it has to be bold, and it has to be transformative. You know, the comfortable middle is not going to come up with a response like that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that the left is necessarily going to ride to power with that agenda and be able to implement it, but by asserting something of that nature, I do think that we can have a profound impact on current policy debate.
I think you would agree with this, but let me know if you don't or you do or whatever. But it seems to me, to the extent that neo-fascism, or in whatever its variations, is a response to neoliberal globalization, you identified some of that response or the reaction against it as being at a cultural level, but like economic dislocation, like the precaritization of work and the extreme concentrations of wealth that co-constitute that, like it's basically extreme inequality that just promises to keep getting worse, that is upstream of the forces of fascism. So if you're going to fight fascism, in so many words, the root cause has to be realizing some form of economic democracy. And like when you look at the WTO protests in '99, when you look at the left's agenda, historically, for the most part, like you could argue that the new social movements don't foreground economics necessarily, but like it just seems to me that like there is no ultimate remedy to this far right as a threat or a rising problem unless you can address economic equality. Does that strike you as correct in terms of like matching solution to problem, or am I missing something?
No, I think that's absolutely correct, but with one important caveat, and that is that kind of addressing of economic inequality as a response to the far right will work as long as the far right hasn't taken up that issue as well. I mean, in a serious way, I mean, just
Yeah.
rhetorically. In other words,
Like if Josh
in
Hawley
Brazil,
became economic democracy guy, we have a problem.
right. So that's the case in Poland, for instance, where the Law and Justice Party actually has pushed through an economic program that, well, I mean, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it does go some way toward evening out the substantial economic inequalities in the country, especially between city and countryside, between generations.
Yeah.
And they've done so in such a way that they've essentially ensured a governing mandate for the party for the foreseeable future, and that there is really no significant political opposition. Contrast that with Bolsonaro in Brazil, where, I mean, Bolsonaro did some bullshit, distribution of money at the beginning of COVID, and that it boosted his popularity prematurely, like a hit of heroin. But at this point, there's no more money to give out, and his popularity has plummeted, and people realize that the extreme inequality in Brazil has begun to reappear. And, this was something that had been the kind of cornerstone of Lula and his successors, was to build on the bolsa, the providing a kind of economic stimulus to the poorest families to bring them up from extreme poverty. All of which is to say that yes, I mean, this is absolutely critical. It's an absolutely critical element for a progressive agenda, and we better push it through before the far right comes to its senses, so to speak, and adopts a program much like Law and Justice did in Poland. One can imagine that there's some successor to Trump out there who will put forward something similar. I mean, you look at Ted Cruz's economic programs. Some of them come very close to promoting an economic democracy approach.
For purely cynical reasons, but nevertheless, yeah.
Exactly.
Just to be clear.
You could imagine that happening here in the United States.
Yeah. So the great mistake then is that the Democratic Party or progressives, and name your country, is to let right-wingers get to our left flank, basically. Like we fail to champion the issues that make us left, and that exposes us to people who respond to those needs, then can be captured by the right.
That's correct. Although, there is a fear I have that what we're talking about right here is all takes place within a traditional political playing field, or on a political playing field, in which essentially you're talking about a competition between parties over a distribution of resources, federal resources, and that it is the job of a politician to basically bring home the bacon, to make sure that the people in their constituency have benefited somehow from the politicking of that representative. Yeah. That's your kind of traditional playbook for politics, at least here in the United States. But in the last 4 years, we've seen an entirely different playbook emerge, in which it seems as though the Republicans have abandoned all notions of this kind of bring home the bacon approach, and instead have adopted an entirely symbolic set of programs that are untethered from reality. Whether we're talking about their focus on critical race theory, or about obviously a stolen election, or any other kind of
communism, yeah.
So then you faced with this dilemma as in this case the Democratic Party. Do we continue to kind of push our traditional approach, and which they have done through the stimulus packages, through Build Back Better, through the infrastructure bill,
and stuff,
deliver the bacon? We got to make sure that especially the poorest, but also lower middle class, working poor, that they see the benefits that we are bringing to them, or do we address the Republicans at the symbolic level? And that's a tough question. I mean, I don't think it's entirely clear whether the Republicans' political strategy of simply focusing on symbolism will be successful. But if they win in the midterms, and if they obviously win in 2024, then that will be a powerful signal that politics as we know it has changed dramatically here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I take your point. Like, reducing inequality, it addresses root causes in a crucial way, or like ultimately that has to be the path. But it operates on like quite a long time scale. So like it doesn't necessarily fix the problems now, but also it requires normal politics. And we're living in an era that seems like it's trending more and more toward like not normal politics. So when you have a couple chapters at the end of the book where you talk about the left response to this, global far right problematic. Can you sort of talk about what you wrote there? Prescriptions, but it was, you speak to it, but hybrid of like prescriptions and observations about what the left is doing in response.
Yeah, so the last couple chapters kind of provide an overview of what's already kind of taking place in terms of transnational organizing on the left, both on an issue basis, but also in terms of what venue the action is taking place. Say in multilateral organizations, or at a regional level, or at a local level. And there's a lot. I mean, if you kind of put on your blinders and stopped looking at Twitter and paid no attention to what, the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, or, the Marine Le Pens of the world are saying, you could be persuaded that the left is doing very well. Okay, it doesn't really control politics in a lot of countries, but at a local level, or at the organizing that takes place, in civil society, the left seems to be doing quite well. But in any case, that there is quite a lot of activity, and I kind of try to chronicle it. But then, I try to understand, well, what's really needed here? And I talked a little bit already about the need to be bold and to come up with something that meets the urgency of the moment. And so I finished the book basically talking about a global Green New Deal. And it, obviously taking into account the Green New Deal or New Deal in particular is rhetoric that doesn't really appeal to people outside the United States. So,
Yeah.
in the work that I'm doing at IPS right now, we talk about it as a global just transition. But it's essentially kind of looking at what we have to do as a international community to do at least two things at once. One, dramatically reduce carbon emissions, and number two, transition to very quickly a clean energy infrastructure for our economies. Now, what the economy will look like as a result of those two things, well, that's controversial, of course.
Yeah.
Some would still argue that you can do that within the framework of capitalism. Others would argue that you need a completely different kind of economic organization. And within that discussion, there are a number of other issues related to the question of economic growth, the nature of culture, and the organization of cities, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of questions here, but I do think that this is where the left has to ultimately converge in coming up with a broad kind of umbrella understanding of what transformation has to take place that can then be adapted according to the local conditions in any given place.
So a green path to economic democracy implemented by transnational organization, transnational progressive movement.
Well, certainly facilitated by that.
Yeah.
I mean, we obviously don't have at a global level anything that resembles the European Union. It's no surprise that the European Union, in some sense, is ahead of all of us in putting together its Green Deal, its European Green Deal. With all of its flaws, it's still much better than what is on the books in pretty much anywhere else in the world. And the fact that it has a mechanism by which the poorer countries within Europe can catch up to the more powerful countries with additional funding is, I think, an important model that can be used for the rest of the world. But that's what we have to be looking at. We have to be looking at these examples that are being fleshed out at both a national level in some countries, Costa Rica, Uruguay, but more importantly at a regional level, like in Europe.
Yeah. What you're saying is right. And clearly if I'm thinking that economic equality is the solution, I'm in this headspace too. I kind of worry that, and there's not like an answer to this, I don't think. Maybe you have one, but I worry that these solutions they're too orthogonal to the immediacy of the far rightists themselves. Like the Nationalist International and this, like the communist witch hunts, the anti-China witch hunts, everyone's a Chinese communist if you don't agree with us kind of thing. That's happening so now. And our solutions, there's a period of time where we need to enact these solutions, but in the interregnum or in the interim, they're pressing this like national emergency button. And it's hard to respond to that. We have the cure, but there's these symptoms that might cause us to have to amputate the leg anyway. I don't know.
Right. Well, I think the problem is that often what we're talking about is a mismatched contest in which they bring the howitzer of emotion and and heated invective, and we bring a couple of binders of paper with our options. And so, and that's why in the book I do address this question of a left populism. In other words, recognizing that dispassionate, scientific policy recommendations are not necessarily going to win the day, at least at the polls.
Yeah.
That the left really has to motivate people in other ways, and the kind of traditional way of doing that is to basically complain about the fat cats, to position the 99% against the 1%.
Yeah.
And, to blame the 1% for everything, even if the 1% isn't to blame for everything. I mean, sure, the 1% has a bigger carbon footprint, but, let's face it, we're all responsible for carbon emissions
Yeah.
going back 150 years. But for political reasons, it's useful to kind of blame the 1% in order to get the 99% on our side and voting for our proposals. How we do that? Well, I mean, there are, I think, responsible ways to do that and irresponsible ways to do that. But nevertheless, I do think some element of that left populism needs to be part of this picture.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's more to say about that, but that is a more hopeful answer than I thought you would give. So that's good. Taking a break, pausing, pivoting from the book, I wanted to talk about your writing in a more meta sense. You write all kinds of shit, novels. You've written at least one play, probably more than one. I'm not familiar with your full canon necessarily, but I know you've done at least one. Can you talk about your experience writing not the novels and the plays? And that's a very different space from the kind of, analytical and advocacy writing that we tend to do, especially people who listen to this show. But there's always been this crossover interest. And I've had a couple guests on who are sort of foreign policy wonks, but then they've dabbled in sci-fi writing and writing other fiction. And you're one of these guys too, but you've done it a lot more than other people. So why do you do it, A? And do you find that kind of writing is any different from doing the sort of nonfiction writing, this analytical writing that you're doing about the far right?
Well, if things had worked out differently, we would be having an entirely different conversation, which you'd be asking me, so you, John, have been writing novels and plays. Why are you now dabbling in foreign policy?
Flip it, yeah.
Because that really would have been, the trajectory I had intended back in the 1980s, 1990s. My desire was to write novels and plays, but to make a living, I was basically writing on foreign policy. Now, of course, I was interested in foreign policy, and I love the way foreign policy offered an opportunity to travel to other places in the world, and that was very much something I wanted to do. But I published my first novel in '97, and I published it under a pseudonym. It came out from Scribner. It was a hardback. It was a very prestigious publisher.
What was it called?
It was called Foamers. And a foamer it's a slang expression used by Amtrak personnel to describe people who are obsessed with trains, because they get on the train and they start foaming at the mouth. So it was a book about train fanatics, and it was a mystery, a thriller. It was a fun book. But in any case, I thought that would have been the beginning of a career as a novelist. And it should have been, but it wasn't. And I won't go into the details of what happened to derail my career, to use the train metaphor. But after that, I didn't publish fiction, from '97 until basically 20 years later. And one of the reasons that I started doing plays was, in some sense, because I felt thwarted in publishing novels, and this was an opportunity to kind of have an immediate relationship with an audience. I was, basically writing and performing one-man shows, and so I did about 10 of them between 2008 and today.
You did 10 one-man shows?
Yeah.
Wow.
Covering lots of different topics. I did one on North Korea. I did one on traveling around Asia in search of the perfect meal. I did one on my mother. I did one on my father. I mean, diverse, shall we say.
Wow, yeah.
And the most recent one was something I took to the Edinburgh Fringe, which was about kind of an imaginary future in which the only determinant of social success is one's sense of humor. And the main character as someone born without any sense of humor whatsoever. So it's kind of an intriguing one-man show. But I was given an opportunity in 2016. I actually was writing a piece. It was supposed to be on U.S.-Russian relations. And my editor, Tom Engelhardt of Tom Dispatch, said, John, I want you to imagine what's coming in U.S.-Russian relations. This was 2015. What do you think? What's going to be the future? And I said, I could write something banal, about what will happen between the United States and Russia. But as I started thinking about it, I started realizing that it was the wrong question, because if we looked at the future, we might not even have a United States or a Russia, and that these kind of unitary states and their relationship, that might be a passing phenomenon. We've certainly seen the disintegration of unitary states like the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia. What would happen if, in fact, this became the dominant trend in international relations? So I wrote a piece by essentially a Europeanist looking back from the year 2050 at the year 2020 and what was kind of the beginning of the end of the nation state. And that became a pretty popular essay. And then Tom asked me, well, this was very popular. Would you be interested in kind of expanding it into a book? And I said, Tom, I basically put everything I can imagine into this essay. I can't think about what a book would look like unless I were to take it in an entirely different direction and turn it into a novel in which the main character, this fellow looking back from 2050, is not only reflecting on the disintegration of the international community, but on the disintegration of his family and how the two go in parallel over the 30 years between 2020 and 2050. So that became kind of the first novel in what is now the Splinterlands trilogy, in which I look at this issue from the perspective of this man in the first book, his ex-wife in the second book, and their daughter in the third book.
Damn, dude, the range and the titillatingness of I have to read more of all this stuff. I was only aware of one of your plays. I didn't realize you had this Scribner's book from the 90s. I was aware of the Splinterlands trilogy, but that was kind of the extent of it. It's very inspirational. Can you talk at a mechanical level or a logistical level, how do you produce so much stuff? What is your writing process, your writing routine? Could you sort of walk me through a day in the life when you've got a writing project going? And do you only do one project at a time, or how does this work?
Well, there's always a deadline. And, deadlines are the best way of, ensuring that you produce stuff. Otherwise, if there's no one breathing down your neck, even if you're the one who's breathing down your own neck, you're not going to get stuff done. So, I've done a weekly column for Foreign Policy and Focus basically since 2007. So 13 more or less years of a weekly column every Monday. And so it comes out every Wednesday, but so every Monday morning I wake up and I'm like, what am I going to write about, this week? And I have basically 2 days to get my act together. I've always had a monthly column, usually for a Korean newspaper. And then, Tom of Tom Dispatch has gotten me to write somewhere between 4 and 8 pieces for him a year, plus assorted op-eds and stuff. So that's kind of the nonfiction work, and all of it is deadline based, and the books basically come out of those assignments one way or another. I did a book on Islamophobia that came out of a piece I did for Tom on the Islamophobic crusades in this country. A book about Korea, a book about the pandemic. So they come out of these. When it comes to fiction, the plays for the last 12 years, I would write during my vacation, which was usually 2 weeks at the end of August, and then revise at the next vacation, which would be the Christmas, New Year's holiday. So every year I would have one play coming out of that process.
Wait, so you'd
And
be
then
writing a draft basically in a couple weeks?
that's correct.
Wow.
And then the novels, for a long time, I was doing just 3 pages a day, first thing in the morning before I do anything else. And if you do 3 pages a day, you got a novel. You got a novel
Yeah.
at the end of 6 months, as long as you're disciplined about it. I haven't been as disciplined about that in the last 6 or 7 years, but just because of the demands of the plays and the nonfiction. But more recently, I've been turning back to that. So, but it's basically, it's like with anything, if you do it enough times, then it becomes just so much easier. If you're writing a weekly column, it just has to become easier, or you're going to go crazy and you're going to stop. You develop a certain facility. Now, when it comes to nonfiction, that's fine, because you're following certain models and you're going to play with those models and templates, but you are not going to go completely wild on them. Mm-hmm. With fiction, you often are going to go off on a completely different trajectory. You're going to break models. You're going to do something completely different. And that requires a somewhat different mindset. It's not, you can't easily say, well, I've written one novel, I've written 2 novels, the third one's just going to be easier. I mean, yeah, if you're doing, Detective Jack Grandy, and you do 26.
Formulaic, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, then sure, you can do that. But if you're doing really a profoundly different kind of novel each time, then each one is going to require heavy lifting. So I can't say that becomes easier necessarily. But it does require carving out the space and also, just giving yourself the time that's necessary to put yourself in an entirely different environment, conceptual environment, to write something of that nature.
Yeah, my writing process is similar, especially how I structure my time. Where do your fictional ideas come from? Like you say, for the nonfiction stuff, it flows out of FPIF or Tom Dispatch, like the op-ed type stuff. But what about fiction? I mean, like the Fomers thing, these like counterfactual imaginary futures, the sci-fi with no humor thing. Like those are all very different things, like where did the ideas come from? Is it idiosyncratic, or you sit down?
It's not like I sit there and think, what kind of novel am I gonna write now? It's more like it's a what if that hits me at some point. What if sex and money were not the dominant kind of features in a society, but a sense of humor was. Where could I take that? Sometimes it's an honest mistake. I mean, I was on a Amtrak train going across country, and I thought I heard 2 guys talking about a tape of a train accident, and I probably misheard them, but I started thinking, well, if there was a tape of a train accident, then they must have known that the train accident took place. They must have known beforehand that the train accident was going to take place so that they could tape it. So did they then cause the train accident in order to tape it? And that led to, a number of thoughts along those lines. Or a book on Korea that I finished recently. And this was a rumor, and I don't know obviously if it's true or not, but as you're probably aware, there were thousands of agents from South Korea who infiltrated North Korean society in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, as there were thousands of North Korean agents who infiltrated South Korean society. But according to the rumor, if you were a South Korean agent who infiltrated the North, and you were successful, you weren't killed up there, and you came back and you debriefed your handler, and they said, hey, that was great information, thank you very much. They'd send you back on a second assignment, under a different identity somewhere else in the country, because you had obviously demonstrated that you were very good at impersonating a North Korean.
Sure.
And then if you survived that, you came back a second time and you debriefed your handler and they said, hey, that's great information. We're going to send you back a third time. And then you go back a third time and somewhere else in the country, you gather more information. You finally get out this third time, you come back to South Korea, you debrief your handler, and then they shoot you. And they shoot you because they assume that if anybody was so successful 3 times going to North Korea, that they must have turned you into a double agent. So I thought, that's kind of interesting. Well, what if a guy comes back, incredibly successful infiltrator of North Korean society, if he comes back and before he debriefs, it hits him, maybe this is not such a good idea. And that set into motion, a whole kind of interesting chain of events. So it's really, there's an initial, what if that then kind of generates all sorts of chains of speculation.
When you get the sort of light bulb go on or the epiphanies, do you just sort of hold on to it in your brain and let it marinate, and then you wait until your holiday or whatever, or are you like jotting it down as soon as you think of it in like a notebook, or like how's that work?
Well, sometimes it just, it seizes you, like got to
start writing. Yeah.
Yeah. You got to start writing. And other times it's just a very faint kind of idea. The one I'm working on, I haven't even started writing it yet. I won't start until the spring, but I'm accumulating lines and ideas. But I also know that this is going to be a very heavy lift because I basically have to learn how to be a dairy farmer. and I'm fortunate that I have good friends who are dairy farmers, and I can shadow them. I've spent a lot of time with them. I know the broad outlines of what it takes to run a dairy operation, but I really have to know the specifics. I need to know the details. So. I got to gather that. Then there's, another set of things I have to learn about. For the train novel, I had to basically throw myself into the mindset of a train fanatic. I interviewed train fans. I went to train conventions. I read every book about trains. I was obsessed like a train fan for the 2 years that it took to write that book.
Well, this is fascinating, John. We've been going on we went longer than we normally do, but there was so much to get to. And I wish we could just like sit down for coffee and talk about this more, because it's fascinating.
Well, when things die down, I'd be happy to come out to New Zealand.
Yeah, better than me going to DC. All right, well, the book is Right Across the World, The Global Networking of the Far Right and the Left Response. Again, my guest today was John Feffer. Thanks for coming on the show, dude.
It was a great pleasure to talk.